Nice to meet you as well.
Yes, nice to meet you too.
Yeah.
I was like, I know I haven't been able to come to any of the other meetings, but yeah, it's good to finally put faces to names. So yeah, nice to meet you both.
Oh,
Like I think my connection is pretty good now, but hopefully it stays that way. But yeah, it seems okay for now. So we'll see how we go.
okay. The we should be streaming.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, I think we got a note. There was a little pop-up that said we were
Saying live streaming.
started. Yeah.
all right, wicked.
But
Then
on the
I'm gonna
website, I don't think it's working.
It is.
It is?
Yep.
Ah, goes to the new. It's Montes Press
Ah,
appearing there.
oh, that's my fault. Sorry. I didn't update the thing. Yeah, now it should be working.
Doing the thing. Refresh the page.
I liked the little design you did with our title. That was cute.
Did you like it?
Yeah, it was very cute.
In the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I think you're ready to go.
You do that now, yeah.
Will you introduce us or we just start?
Yes.
That was the question. Okay, cool. Yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah, you're ready. Yeah, you can go.
Okay. Nice. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today is the 4th lecture of the Graphic Design Confabulations series. It's the first time that we are doing at noon because of time zone. And so my name is Rita. I'm from Brazil. I'm in the 2nd year of the Master in Graphic Design at the Estonian Academy of Art.
And my name is Mark. I'm also in the 2nd year of the graphic design program here.
And we're gonna just say a few words about the Graphic Design Confabulations. So this project is a series of lectures, part of the Master in the Estonian Academy of Arts, and initiated by our teacher, Rosen Iveli. So the lectures, we invite not only graphic designers, but also artists, curators, writers, publishers, performers, in order to rethink or decenter normative structures and practices. So today we invited Roberta and Naomi, and we got in touch with their work because of Nancy, who collaborated in one of their projects. And also Nancy had participated in the Masters with us last year. So Roberta and Naomi are South diaspora women who works as artists, curators, and producers based in Australia, exploring alternative narratives, radical thought, and deep connection. Naomi and Roberta have collaborated over the last 5 years with the aim of making visible the complex African narratives within the Australia diaspora. Together, they created and produced within mixed mediums of video, installation, sound, performance, and reframings of the archive, proposing sites of self-determination and connection, rooted in Black feminist theory and practice. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. We are really excited for the talk. And people who want to ask questions, you can use the chat. And we're gonna open for questions right after they present. Thank you so much, Roberta and Naomi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Roberta.
And I'm Naomi.
Naomi's obviously on the other screen.
Yeah.
Firstly, we'd like to acknowledge the lands on where we are both currently speaking from. Myself on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and Naomi on the country of the Whadjuk peoples. We pay our deepest respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We recognise sovereignty was never ceded,
and that we live and benefit upon stolen lands. We come with the intention of our work and our project, and she was wearing trousers, to share knowledge and stories that hope to celebrate and connect with Southern African figures of our past, future, and present. We hope our work can be part of a discourse that speaks to the importance of Black voices, experiences, and stories. We respect First Nations communities' connections to land, waterways, and skies, that we hope to deepen an understanding within our own ancestral pathways and learn from our peer Black First Nations communities to inform how we all connect with our motherlands.
So what Roberta just shared with you and that you can see on the screen is an acknowledgement of country. This is in most cases and should be is practiced widely across the nation state of Australia to respect to respectfully and continue to exist despite colonial violence that is experienced by Black First Nations communities here in Australia, and how this also relates to the wider community. As Black and Brown settlers on unceded lands, we benefit from living on stolen land, and it's important to acknowledge how this affects our lives as citizens within such a place. It is also important to recognise that there is no treaty or no mention of First Nations peoples in our constitution of this place. Acknowledging and paying our respects to First Nations folks is part of anti-racism work and efforts towards Black justice. My name's Naomi Valapi. I'm of Zimbabwean and Japanese descent, and I'm usually based in Naarm, which is known as Melbourne, but currently in Perth, known as Boorloo. I have a green wall behind me, and I have brown skin and dark curly hair, and I'm wearing a pink and grey top. My practice is working as a producer, and as Rita earlier mentioned, it's centered around kind of bringing together alternative narratives, radical thought, and deep connection. I also focus on facilitating new work creation for independent artists working across various disciplines. This comes from working both within institutions such as theatres, art centres and galleries, but also alongside artists. Through my work, I aim to unearth honest and generous collaborations between artists, producers, curators and presenters. And my curatorial interests are really derived through my experience as a woman of African and Asian identities and the communities that I represent.
And as you already know, my name is Roberta Joyrich. I am a Southern African diaspora woman, also based in Naarm, and I have dark brown, curly long hair. I'm wearing a black t-shirt and have gold hoops with light skin complexion, and I'm in a room, which is my studio, of white walls and lots of random objects. I predominantly work as a visual artist, working across a variety of methodologies within my practice. And I'm also sometimes a curator. Alongside my practices as an artist, I also work as an arts educator in academic fine arts spaces, but also within specialist learning spaces with vulnerable youth who are in custodial care. My work often engages with archives in some way, whether it's incorporating personal objects, photographs or documents from institutional archives or products of government systems. And I also engage heavily in various forms of research to inform my creativity, from more traditional academic research to communal knowledge systems, by working with many of the communities that I belong to or are connected to. Naomi and I met about 5 years ago while she was producing at a place called Arts House, inviting me to present work within a program of Black women artists. Since meeting and working together, we continue to connect and share dialogues about being African within the diaspora and about representation and the lack of agency and autonomy we felt we had about our own experiences and histories in places such as museums, libraries, and the contemporary art world. So the image that you see on screen is part of a creative development that Naomi and I were doing during COVID lockdown, exploring concepts of translation and language. So this is a video still of a work that was in development where we're having conversations with our parents in their mother tongue and unpacking these translations from African languages into English. So this is an example of the various developments that we engaged in together, which has led us to the initiation of the project, And She Was Wearing Trousers.
So Roberta and I began our collaboration by recognising the failure of archives in our current context to appropriately and effectively connect to our understanding of self or merely see ourselves. One of our first activities or field research, if you like, was that we visited two public libraries in Melbourne, the State Library of Victoria and the local city council called the City Library. Both are based in the CBD and accessible to anyone who can come and borrow.
From these two visits, it was very clear that there were many gaps, but also lots of large, broad strokes when it came to African histories. Our interests were within the southern region of Africa, and identifying relevant texts that we came to find in these libraries were mostly books about Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe, the apartheid regime, or publications that appeared to homogenize the whole continent or ethnic groups more generally. So from here on in, this inspired such questions of who are the women of our histories and how do we hear of them and what do we learn from them?
As we started to research more about Southern African feminists we were not familiar with, we started to gain a sense of who spoke for them, or rather why we didn't know of them. And it encouraged us to platform as much as possible within the program creation and delivery of this project to centre the Black women who had a connection to Africa's South and for their voices to be very active.
And She Was Wearing Trousers, a call to our heroines, brought into focus some of the many women who defined, defied, or described Southern African culture from the 17th century to today through a series of premieres and new commissions. Installations, film, performance, and conversations unearthed often forgotten feminists exploring ideas of identity, connection, distance, and self. The forms of inquiry taken were as diverse as the experiences of the women behind them. Working from archives across independent publishers, oral histories, public and private, the academy and the internet, the women, Brenda Fassie, Dorothy Masuka, Princess Krotoa, Tenjiwe Lesabe, and Queen Lozake, and figures alike served as catalysts into an imagined world by which hope, loss, love, and determination for us were explored.
So archives speak of copper wire, liberation, teachers, linguists, and queens, of women we should know but don't know, were constructed through colonized frames of histories. The title, translated from lyrics of Dorothy Masuka's song Nolishwa, And She Was Wearing Trousers, imagines the possibilities of actors of text and dialogue between Southern African and Arab.
a culmination of a series of conversations of women of the African diaspora and those on the continent. We examined how figures in Southern African history served as entry points into reimagining a Black female experience in the past and future. These women are often framed as contentious, yet their contributions to society are influential, equivocal, and are important African women's voices to platform, to share, and to learn from. The power of interpretation and nuance creates a space for tension and discovery. And this continuity allows us to creatively explore our relationships with these women and the proximity we share with them. So on this current slide on the left, you'll see this is Dorothy Masuka, who is also wearing pants, which kind of relates to the title of the exhibition. And on the right, a series of archives that were exhibited, but also relate to our inquiries with another film work behind.
So our exhibition took place at Arts House in North Melbourne and featured local African artists Kirsty Marilia, Rara Zulu and Tururu Mavondo, and international artists Sitembule Mzanze, Jabu Nadia Newman, Black Banana and Nontsikelele Mutiti, as well as contributions from Santila Chingaipe, Samira Farah and Zara Julius. So today we would like to speak a little bit about two elements of this exhibition that contribute to our curatorial rationale that we've nicknamed Call and Response, a community screen printing workshop and a methodology of making between artists in the diaspora and those on the continent.
As part of exploring connection, identity, and Black feminist histories experienced between artists and the community, it felt necessary to initiate a dialogue that took place locally as well as internationally. We'd like to share with you in more detail about this process of call and response, which became a key curatorial methodology within this project, and its relationship to the creation of artworks Auntie's Curtain and 4 other artworks in the exhibition that Naomi will share a bit more about: Kirsty, Jabu, Rara Zulu and Black Banana's work through this lens as well. So again, you'll see on screen to the left that I'll discuss in a moment about Auntie's Curtain and Sitembule Msizane's film work in the background. And on the right, Tururu Mavondo's sound work, with also Kirsty and Black Banana's video works in the background as well.
This idea of call and response as a process has this dual action taking place, creating these cycles where the call somewhat took many forms. For us as curators of this project and our inquiry, the call came from material texts and various archives and their complex nature, or as a treatment that inspired intergenerational dialogue.
Recognizing these moments of connection and the cycles they form are really significant for us and our interest in forming communities, connections and relationships, both within the African diaspora globally and back to the African continent. This process feels like a type of refusal or resistance to histories and ongoing imperialist divide and conquer type strategies, symptoms of colonialism and coercion that can occur upon First Nations, African and communities of colour, that continue today. Naomi and I recognise the importance of reflecting on how we as diaspora African Black women are situated within and on unceded Black land, essentially as uninvited guests. We were interested in the stories and histories of our Southern African communities and elders, and we had questions of how we share and tell our stories within this complex context. The stories and experiences of communities that make up the African diaspora can sometimes be siloed within and homogenized within Western frameworks. So throughout this project, we felt driven by the importance of finding the places where we can connect and speak about our heterogeneous stories together in a way that felt generative, genuine, and safe. African commemorative cloths also fascinated the both of us and its potential to tell stories. We were conscious that African wax print textiles are quickly used when visually representing African projects, which makes sense, of course, but we also wanted to lean into a more specific visual identity. So African commemorative cloths, they often celebrate a significant event or person and have expansive histories across the continent. There are many varieties and styles, but in our surface research, we noticed that many of these cloths were of men, sometimes of women, but mostly of men. So simultaneously in noticing this and thinking about the positionality of African women in history, narratives and ideas emerged. Auntie's Curtain is an expansive collaborative print project inspired by African commemorative cloths and fabrics. So its aesthetic and design is rooted in the narrative of gifts received, of shwe and textiles that were given to both of us by women in our families when we visited the African continent, respectively. This was a really strong narrative that I kept returning to that would inform the frame of the textile's design, but be the starting point of encouraging stories among Afro-diaspora women of connection and memory, with the hope to engage in an active and open dialogue with our peer community. So it felt appropriate that this textile be collaborative and reference a discourse of African textiles, and the framework of an African commemorative cloth could represent a diaspora of African women and a multiplicity of voices and stories. So coming together to develop and create this textile also established a site of connection, creating these cyclic forms within our relationships and within the collaboration. So in preparation for the workshop, which you can see a still of in front of you, we asked what material object represents the identity and strength you see in African women. So this would, of course, inform the nature of our collaboration in both conversational dialogue and ultimately the aesthetics and outcome of the textile artwork. So this invitation was our call within our peer African community of social peers, artists and family to consider this question and contribute a response. After receiving everybody's contributions to the call, they were transferred to silk screens and prepared for everyone to come together and engage in a screen printing workshop with Spacecraft Studios to create Auntie's Curtain. There was a really exciting energy in the room. It was extremely jovial, but there was also this air of confidence in sharing story and connecting with one another. In the context of Settler Nation Australia, African women, or just generally people of colour, tend to be the token in the room and are not always granted the comfort or safety to express themselves within many contexts. So Spacecraft were extremely generous in enabling us to temporarily take over their space, but also in facilitating the screen printing process. Some women had never screen printed before or engaged in art making at all, while others were creative but had also never screen printed before, to then some who were much more versed. So there were really varying levels of experience and engagement throughout the workshop. And further, because of the collaborative nature of screen printing, again, these cyclic connections and forms were happening. We were supporting one another and celebrating one another during the learning process, while physically and literally passing printing tools back and forth between each other to create the textile. In addition to all of this, Naomi and I discussed about our thinking for the exhibition and curation of And She Was Wearing Trousers, while also sharing what we had learned so far about the heroines, Brenda Fassie, Tenjiwe Lesabe, Dorothy Masuka, Princess Krotoa, and Queen Lozake. This process of sharing our findings about these significant women, or the significance of these African women who were not always loudly celebrated, coupled with our own learning of one another's experiences and stories of all of our peer African herstories. We shared taking turns printing, and around the room, there were these really beautiful moments of one another discussing the meaning of what we had selected and why. There were conversations happening as a whole group, and then more conversations evolving in smaller cliques. So again, there are these multiple layers of sharing and cyclical connections taking place, of relationship building and knowledge sharing and connections forming, all while we gathered to create Auntie's Curtain. So within the curtain, there are many stories and voices embedded within the images printed. The contributions or responses from the Afro diaspora women we invited sat alongside the aforementioned Southern African heroines, who occupy frames within the textile, collectively platforming stories of African women. So one of the workshop participants, Tab, who is a textile designer and printer herself, shared her own artwork, which you can see in the right image with the pink and green colours in the foreground. So this was one of her artworks of beautiful gestural line drawings as a symbol of strength and African female identity. As a Botswanan woman, she really wanted to portray the gestural markings and the choreography involved in the construction of mud housing in Botswana, made by the women in her community. Robin shared nostalgia from her first trip to South Africa as an adolescent, and a memory of women working in pop-up market stalls. So these women would make and sell woven tops, and Robin had purchased one of these tops from their stalls, and she still carries it with her today. So this formed the image for her contribution to the textile in the workshop, recognising and appreciating the women's labour tied to her memory. Another participant, Zenya, inspired by the exhibition's elements of call and response, selected an abeng, and you'll see that's the bottom left with the teal and monochrome picture inside. So utilised, an abeng utilised by Queen Nanny of Jamaica is a cow horn, and when blown into, the sound symbolised a calling upon her community to come together in times of need. So Zenya's story about this object also speaks to narratives of African communities and their journeys away from the continent, but draws links to the significance of the cow and its presence in Jamaican and Southern African cultural practice and history. So these are just some of the many stories embedded within Auntie's Curtain. And upon the textile's completion, the artwork had a commanding presence, sizing at 9 meters by 4 meters in height. After experiencing Nonsikolelo Mutiti's work Mimeza on the building's exterior, which we showed you an image of earlier, the viewer would encounter Auntie's Curtain in the first studio alongside archival materials displayed that related to our conceptual research and inquiry, as well as the newly commissioned artworks by artists in the exhibition. So you can't see it in this image, but opposite the curtain was a film work projected that was in the previous images shown by Setembile Msizane of a African matriarchal figure. So together, this curtain, the film work and the archives aim to establish a dialogue of the experiences and visions of African women, both within the past, our present and future, by incorporating affirming stories of our Afro-diasporic female community in Melbourne, with those historically within the African continent.
Thanks, Roberta. So as Roberta mentioned, Auntie's curtain sort of beautifully occupied what we called Studio One and served as this entry point into the local context, sort of before expanding into the narratives of cross-continent collaborations in Studio Two. As you can see on the slide, this is just from one of our conversations, but Zoom was a really effective tool across the 2 years that we were trying to develop this project. And I think there were a number of conversations about the women, and people had heard of them. And yeah, that sort of period of kind of discovery really happened across about 6 months or so, particularly with the relationships between Black Banana and Jabu Nadia Newman. So as we built relationships and dialogues with two of those artists, we were really initially interested to hear how much they knew about some of these women, and what we had been exploring. So yeah, just really very sort of experiential, not mundane, but like in Cape Town, whether Jabu had heard about these types of things happening. We also posed similar questions to Rara Zulu and Kirsten Marilia, based in Nam and also Sydney as well. Realizing the context and unpacking of these histories together and also individually could really play an exciting role in sort of new archive creation. So there was a particular process we created around responding to the archives of these heroines, of these particular artists. The artists took part in an exercise where contrasting contexts and forms would generate new ways of talking about these histories, call, if you like, to a new way of reading. They and Rara created their works based on responding to Princess Krotoa and Dorothy Masuka, respectively. And as a new form, this new archive, or reimagined archive, was then passed to the South African-based artist Jabu and Black Banana, who then created new works inspired by this sort of new archive and version of history from their now peers, I guess. So Kirsty is an actress and a playwright, Jabu is a filmmaker, and Rara is a musician. Their disciplines and creative forms, complex identities that we hold as Black. So the act of calling and responding to one another also stemmed from an interest in the importance of oral archives and the stories captured within this. So orality as a practice is a long-standing feature of global Indigenous Black and Brown communities. The women we explore are significant orators in their ability and skills, and powerful influence, and encourage a type of call and response for collective action. So while Farsi and Masuku call for change through song, Lasabe and Lozake lay important political groundwork in an elusive but significant call of action within their community. And Chris and power through her oral practice as a translator that also raises deeper questions into the legacies of these women and how their oral practices of calling or responding resonate within the diaspora on the African continent. So upon entry to Studio 2, you see an image here of Kirsty's video work. Slide into my displacement on view, which is a literal call via direct message to Princess Krotoa, speak to the yearning for history and identity she can't quite ask. And Jason, that's a bit hard to speak, is Abu's video work, which acts as a lullaby to an imagined contemporary and the things she wishes she could tell her through the form of a creation story.
Naomi.
Nolly, the 4-channel sound installation by highlighting the freedom the women described in Dorothy. If I'm still connecting okay?
Is the connection okay? Oh.
Maybe just repeat this last part because the connection failed a little bit. If you could repeat just the last. Oh, maybe now the connection.
Perhaps she dropped out. While she's coming back in, I can kind of repeat what Naomi was saying. So as you can see here, this was kind of upon entry into Studio 2. So the kind of Instagram DM looking screen is Kirsty Morellier's video work, Slide into My Displacement. And it's a literal call via DNA, like a DM to Princess Krotoa, speaking to the yearning of a history and identity that she can't quite grasp. And in this next slide, the lower video screen, it's kind of hard to capture in images, but this is opposite the other video work, is Jabu's Nadia Newman's work, A Bedtime Story, which acts as a love letter to an imagined contemporary Princess Crow and all the things she wishes she could tell through the form of a creation story. Naomi is just trying to connect. So while she's doing that, I might just continue on her. Oh, wait. I think she's back.
Technical Zoom.
Cross continents connections.
Hello. Sorry.
Okay, Naomi.
Can you hear
continue?
me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah,
sounds
much clearer
great.
now.
Yeah. I think you're at slide 18. I just repeated the last bit for you.
Okay. I wonder if just because my connection's not great, whether I might just turn my video off and you guys can look at the images and I can just talk until we get to the questions bit. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks. So where was I? I was talking about Kirsty's work, wasn't I? I think I got up to about Rara. Did you hear that bit?
Yes.
Okay.
So up to Nolly.
Yeah, okay, cool. I'll go from there. So I think if you go to the next slide, Roberta, Nolly is a 4-channel sound installation by Rara Zulu and starts the call in the space as an electronic soul-based soundtrack highlighting the freedom of women described in Dorothy Masuka's original track, Nolishwa. Black Banana's video collage is housed above this in line with the frame and carries forth the ideas of women being free, referencing June Jordan's A Poem for South African Women, which is a commemoration of the 40,000 women and children who protested against the Dom Pass, an identity card which dictated what public spaces one was allowed to occupy. So Studio 2 with these artists aims to take the audience into a space of layers, textures, and complexity through sound and video as a more performative experience for the audience, the works in this space are all housed within a timber frame, sort of referencing their connectedness. The structure encourages the audience to move through the space, initiating many viewpoints and listening points for the works. The works were also arranged on a loop of sound, video, and silence. So for some, the experience was full-bodied, whereas for others, it became more fractured. This again speaks to our experience of connectedness developed with peers and the sort of fractured nature of our archives and histories. These works were seen as one installation reframing stories and the archives of these women. And I think it also touches on sort of the cyclical nature that Roberta was referencing in the workshop as well. But there's this idea of the loop is sort of a big theme as well, in that whilst there is sort of this call and response to histories and to archives, we are just all really connected in certain ways. And the collaboration reinforces sort of the call across borders can be collapsed by diasporic communities as well. So yeah, so the term archive, we feel, comes with a real weight. It's often based around a material document or library. Societies have attempted to control readings of histories, and for African history, the written has superseded spoken word as a dominant approach to research, undermining the local claims for sovereignty, which we also see in the context of so-called Australia. Whilst much of the research and learning for this exhibition has been derived from such material documentation, there's a tension around collecting and extracting that has taken place, and the rich insights we've been able to access through such archives. In thinking about the archive, this project seeks to highlight the absences, reimagine and create a new archive, an archive where readings and perspectives held within the oral histories, anecdotes and artworks we are cultivating through peers are sort of are as important as those found on the shelves of a library. And that's what we really aim to honour in this exhibition.
And as Naomi's saying, within this exhibition, this process of call and response, it's also related to some thinking influenced by Saidiya Hartman. I might just read a question that Saidiya talks about in her text, Venus in Two Acts. She says, "Is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archive?" Now, this question, of course, is very much rooted in a very specific narrative that Saidiya is talking about the Middle Passage and about the violence of an absence of Black women within this particular archive. But I think that this kind of thinking can also parallel some of the themes and complexities that Naomi and I are working through, where because we are in the diaspora and second generation, our access to archives, and even for those on the continent, some of these archives are extremely violent and extremely painful. And so it's kind of also about this question of, well, why revisit the archive? And she talks about like this idea of a critical fabulation, which you may be familiar with, but this idea of a reimagining of sorts. So in some ways, within this thinking, what we're trying to achieve through creating our own archive and this exhibition is our own kind of critical fabulations that reimagine elements within African Black feminist histories within our past that there's the impossibility of knowing exactly, but through various archives we've been able to access, we can consider and reimagine and create, within this thinking. I'm not sure if this is a good time to perhaps see if anyone had any questions about the exhibition, or Hita and Mark, if you had any questions for us.
That sounds good. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
So interesting to hear more. Do you want to
Yeah, if you had
start?
something, or I can also.
Maybe you can start. I'm preparing here.
Yeah, sure.
Question.
So yeah, really love this kind of idea of call and response, and in how the artists working together were calling and responding, and especially in Auntie's Curtain, where just the conversation is like almost very literally a part of the work itself, and almost as an artifact. And I guess just wondering kind of how some of these relationships and conversations through this project have continued or are continuing, and what maybe that has led to for you, or maybe what is happening right now with the two of you.
You want to go better?
Okay, yeah, I think so as I was saying, like in the workshop, there were women who had never really made art before. And so when the exhibition opened and the work was up, these women, of course, came through to the exhibition and, was able to view the work within the larger context of the exhibition. And yeah, there was many kind of dialogues that I could draw upon that the exhibition kind of generated. But some of these women in the workshop, including with myself, that we'd met for the first time, and relationships obviously being a significant part of both of the work that Naomi and myself do. I have since engaged in other activities, not necessarily art making, but from recent film releases portraying African stories, or the new Marvel film, and creating again, or maintaining the relationships as well, because I think sometimes within the art world, I can't necessarily speak for the design world, but there is this extraction that can take place, and it doesn't really honor the kind of reciprocity within the two individuals. So yeah, since the workshop, we both still connect with the women, and new relationships and friendships have formed, and we do hope that the curtain can live on again in another iteration, but build upon that conversation. I don't know if you want to add anything now.
I mean, the only thing I would probably add is that, like Roberta said, it was kind of a mix of women. So some women I knew, some women Roberta knew, like some were my family as well. And I think there was just this sort of the non-art family. So they were sort of really excited by being a part of something that was maybe something very new to them, and having sort of like my cousin and then my younger cousin, who just wanted to play on her phone, to be fair, for part of the workshop. But I think just this notion of having space to think about those types of things amongst a group of women, and to think really critically about their position in a place like Melbourne, Australia, I think was something that they hadn't really done before. And I don't know, for me, that ongoing conversation that I can now have with them about the types of things I do, I think is really important. And whilst my niece on her phone my cousin on her phone probably doesn't quite appreciate it right now, her mum is just like, I'm really glad that she's within, has this space. And I think those types of things are really kind of it's not immediate, it's sort of an ongoing conversation. But I think it's the first time that there's sort of been that many, I feel like, African Australian or diaspora women in an artistic space, like presented like that, as far as we both know. So that kind of feels like, I guess it's sort of affirming as well when you sort of see younger or other community members coming through, kind of trying to connect with these stories and see something that they hadn't really heard before. So yeah.
That's really nice. Do you want to add something?
No, you go ahead.
Because I think during the whole talk, I was really happy to hear these like backstage things, because it really like you're facilitating these moments of sharing and gathering, and that's part of the work. So it's really nice, something that we couldn't really see like on the website, and reading the things and then getting to know that you did this work is like super inspiring. And it is what like you're talking about. So it's not like creating and then commissioning the work and then people just do the work and do the exhibition. You're like really creating these moments, because in the end, like that's the thing that stays after the project.
Totally.
Like you said, like these small moments in the silk screen workshop, people sharing. Yeah, that's really, maybe I can follow up this with a question as well. I'm thinking, I've been thinking a lot about the challenges when we dislocate like a culture from its original context. And I bet you also think a lot about. So I'm from Brazil and I live in Estonia. So my question is a bit like, what do you think is one of the challenges you faced or could be faced when you dislocate a culture from its original context? Here in Estonia, we are a really diverse international group from all over the world, different continents, and lots of these times, these questions arise of what does it mean and how things change when we speak from a different location. And personally, I have a really strong connection with Brazilian traditional culture when I'm back in Brazil for my whole life. And then I have one specific position while I'm there, by being a white person and participating and living the traditional Brazilian culture that comes 100% from Africa and from indigenous culture. And here, when I'm there, I have one relation that I'm used to have, because it's something like day-to-day life and family and friends and the community and like music, dance, these festivities. But here the relation changes because I'm by myself. So it feels a lot of times feels so weird to talk about those things or try to show people, is this relation like I'm not there, I'm talking on behalf of like a whole complex thing. I don't know if it's something that you could share a little bit on how it was for you.
Naomi, do you want?
Okay. I can go. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like one of the key reasons that we kind of entered into this dialogue. And I think, I mean, my background of working as a producer, and I guess it's very much about relationships and trying to work with people for sort of longer artists, mostly more artists, for a long period of time to kind of enable them to have an outcome, which might be, you know, a show or exhibition or whatever that might be. But for the most interesting part for me is everything before that. But I think, this kind of when you do feel really disconnected from something and people want to know something about that thing when you're not in that context, I think is kind of pretty unnerving, I think, sometimes. And I guess it's just that this project has really been very much about sort of speaking to all the different artists, and often this is a conversation that they've only had for the first, that they've had for the first time for a lot of I feel like the Australian artists in particular who are from the Afro diaspora. So like Toriro, for example, I think was really I guess just because Australia is like a white majority country, she had sort of she was like in the middle of very much like a journey of discovery and traveling through like Brazil and a bunch of other the Caribbean and a bunch of different places to kind of I guess really flipped that experience for herself. But being in dialogue with her about that, I think at that moment, and you can probably on the website there's sort of a snippet of her work, but even if you listen I think it was just really interesting that she was just making this work about Zimbabwean. She sort of was kind of very much focused on the political women, so people like Queen Lozakei and Kratoa, and sort of these women who were very much involved in political movements, but obviously often not really heard of. And so for her to kind of take that and be sort of in the Caribbean, thinking about mostly growing up in Australia, being in the Caribbean, writing this sort of ode to these women, I think is just a really kind of beautiful way of thinking about how we kind of keep moving, I think, in the world. But yeah, obviously we were all speaking to her, like she usually lives in Melbourne, but the whole kind of development of that work was on Zoom because of COVID, but also because she was moving around the world a little bit as well. So I think that's kind of just like one little example, I think, of, I don't think it's easy, but I think you just got to keep talking, I think, is the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really, yeah, as Naomi was saying, what has driven this project as well, because our identities are always in flux, right? Like it's changing constantly. And, you know, for like, I think it's not asked as widely as much, but I feel like in the generation that Naomi and I grew up in, you know, you'd be asked like, where are you from? And it's such a loaded question in Australia, because Australia is full of a variety of various migrant groups. Essentially, everyone is a migrant, including the British, but, you know, the colonial kind of regime has shifted that thinking to not think that they are. So when you're asked this question of like, where are you from? It's so loaded because it's already like, well, I'm from here. What do you mean? Do I not look like I'm from here or whatnot? And then, you know, so my identity, like being as a South African woman, but then my ethnicity group within South Africa is also really heterogeneous and complex. So, you know, and then when one would visit a place as well, your citizen identity or the things that, you know, my accent or whatnot then highlight, and that is in shift again. So I think, like what Naomi was saying, it's extremely prevalent constantly in Australia. And I think that's what's driven us to really want to have these conversations, but with a certain specificity as well, of acknowledging we are within the diaspora. So this is our experience, but also wanting to form that bridge so that it's not siloed conversations about how to navigate these kind of complex environments and conversations.
And I think, I mean, the only other thing I would add is just I guess there was a focus on Southern dialogues, and that's kind of really something that we, I guess, made a conscious choice about doing, given that there are really diverse African communities within Australia. Yeah, from East Africa and West Africa as well. But the Southern conversation for us felt like, yeah, quite specific, because there, you know, even on the continent, there is sort of this relationship, but like a deeper relationship around how people moved, or how, yeah, cultural groups moved through those areas. So yeah, there was also kind of a conscious choice to do that, which has been, I think, also a point of discussion at times of like, in this context of Australia, is it, do we need to do this, or what does that mean, or who what stories are we not able to tell? But I think, yeah, we found ourselves, I mean, that the workshop, we ended up inviting a broader group, which I think, but then we sort of shared this very specific thing, which felt really really exciting. So yeah.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing.
Maybe, yeah, I could read a question here from Carlo, who's a fellow student as well. He says, thank you for the talk. I was also thinking about Venus in 2 acts. Having said this, I want to ask you, when working with gaps and fragmented stories, how do you take into consideration what and if something needs to be told or completed? And what is the responsibility on representing absent lives?
I think this is really important, and this is something that comes up within some of my other practices and projects. But I think a key thing is in retelling the narrative or the story, who is it serving and how is it serving? I think within some of the stories we learned about these Southern African heroines and figures alike, they were really like fascinating, but also very, violent and sad narratives that we learned about these women. But in the curation of this exhibition, our focus was affirming stories and, I guess, presenting the African female body with strength within it. And though there are these moments where it speaks to loss and such, that loss is simultaneously counteracted with love and, I guess, a presence of sorts. So I think a key thing is thinking about who the narrative is serving within reigniting these archives, because as Sadia kind of touches on and suggests, is that, you know, by going back to these places of violence, is it just reinstating the violence? And there are examples, and it does happen, you know, and when I think back to previous works within my practice where what I was angry about or trying to passionately evoke, in hindsight, that work was for a white gaze. And so I think it obviously depends on the context and the project and its goals, but I think that's a key question for me, is like, what is the context or the community it's sitting within, and who is the work serving?
I mean, I think there is that question again is feels really pertinent to Toriro's work in particular, because that process, you know, in some ways it's like there's a reason you can't find these stories. There's a reason why, like, you know, there's a number of things at play that these stories are silenced or they're not visible, and those sorts of things. And she sort of started a research, you know, her research process was very much about you know, using things like Facebook and kind of reconnecting with women on the continent and having a conversation with them to then sort of inform some of her story. And then in terms of like when those questions are around like, do these women want to be identified? Do they want their names kind of visible in what we're talking about? Just like, nope. I've had strict instructions to not make that available, because I think particularly, I mean, this is very specific to Zimbabwe, but the political situation there has meant that you just can't talk, you're just not allowed to talk about certain things, and I think patriarchy was another key theme that kind of kept coming up through some of the stories, and in terms of how that just constantly I guess silenced certain stories. But I think in terms of we were really kind of conscious of creating, I guess, a safe environment for the stories to be shared. And again, kind of touching on what Roberta was saying about who is it for, is very much at the core of what is present, what is absent. And I think that's why another element of the curation was really making sure that there was space for dialogue, not just the show. And so we had we've actually got the talks up on our website, you can go and have a listen to if you'd like at some point. But there were just some really kind of unpacking some of those stories is really kind of about, I guess, liveness kind of can fill in the gaps a little bit too. And also Rara did a performance, which I think it was about bringing together a community of people, and in that kind of gathering, being able to talk about some of those to kind of fill those gaps in a kind of more ephemeral way, I think is kind of really an important space to have as well. I don't know if that answers this question, but they're just some thoughts.
No, definitely. And I guess, again, see this in your response to my question earlier. It's like the work is more serving the sort of story and the experiences, and that's kind of first, rather than like the extraction that you kind of mentioned, that the like output or the thing that's made. It's actually secondary to, from what I'm understanding or kind of hearing from this project. And I think that's really kind of refreshing to hear, to think of it in this way.
Yes. I think that's, we have
one more
here. I think it can be the last one, because it's also very late in Australia. We don't want you to work until late. Is a question from Rosen. Hi, what other projects are you working on? And has
She was wearing, and she.
And has as she was wearing trousers influenced them? If so, how? Projects.
Well, I've actually also had a baby this year, so it's been a bit of a crazy time. So I haven't really done anything since this project. But in saying that, we yes, exactly. So in saying that, though, we are kind of really excited about maybe doing some residencies in the next sort of couple of years, I reckon, to try and actually, because we weren't able to bring the Southern African artists over to Australia because of COVID. So it would just be really great for us to all be in the same space together for a period of time. So we've are sort of talking about that. But Roberta's also going to Africa in a few weeks. Yeah. So
yeah. So these kinds of moments and opportunities also assist in following up, well, not following up necessarily, but being back within place and connecting with place, reigniting musings, but also thinking about the types of spaces or partnerships that could occur, because it would be really great to, because of COVID that prevented elements, reconnect with these artists again. So I'm hoping to catch up with Jabu and Black Banana when I'm over there, as they're based in Cape Town, as well as Satimbile as well. But yeah, I think while we're kind of developing and working a frame for this, and of course working internationally, it requires external support and funding. So these processes are also contribute to a kind of timeline. And I guess I kind of touched on it in a I guess more nuanced way, but in Settler Nation Australia, there's a strong focus on residencies in, say, Europe or Asia Pacific, because of the kind of relationships, colonial and otherwise, that exist there. So what Naomi and I are doing in terms of connecting the African continent with African creative scene in Melbourne is really, like, there's not really anyone else working in this space. So we're, working within the means that we can, but to hopefully one day establish, a supportive partnership so that, the next generation of young African artists can, see that there's also opportunities for creation and other elements. But yeah.
I think this is just a bit of an aside, but because I haven't been as mobile as Roberta has been, or just due to my circumstances, I've been thinking very much about the immediate things that are, I guess, other archives, again, that are very much in my local area where I live in Melbourne. And there's actually a Victorian Archive Centre, which has a collection of African archives which I'm kind of just really curious about, because they're sort of, you know, but I mean, that information is not readily available, but it was only through sort of other conversations that it's like, did you know that there's this other this archive within there that sort of is collecting African Australian stories and things like that. And so for me, that kind of just sparked an interest in terms of like, what's that mode of collection, who's collecting them, why are they collecting them, all those sorts of things. And then there's another place called the Centre for Post-Colonial Studies, which also has a big, which is also just up the road from me, and has sort of a decent library amongst other things. And I guess those two spaces are kind of, I don't know, just a point of inquiry, just in terms of their proximity to me physically, but just also in terms of what sort of stories or they're collecting and the mechanisms and how they're kind of doing that is just something I'm kind of keen to explore.
Yeah, they're really like, they're these kind of deeply embedded, but repositories of these kind of narratives and histories and whatnot. But there are a lot of us doing the work, but again, because of the symptom of these kind of Western frameworks, they're siloed. There's also Santilla Jingape, who wrote the catalogue essay for And She Was Wearing Trousers, has just finished a SBS documentary series that speaks about African convicts within Settler Nation Australia. And when Naomi and I learnt of these, it really blows your mind, because these are not the kind of histories that are told to us or taught to us. I mean, let alone First Nations histories is not even. So that's the kind of context that we're working within. But there are really exciting strides and work being done.
And I think, I mean, I'm conscious of time, but I think the discourse between First Nations folks and African diaspora folks in Australia, it's really complicated, I think. And that's why we kind of wanted to speak a little bit to the acknowledgement at the start, just because it is an ongoing dialogue, I think. And, you know, colonial violence does awful things, and the kind of residues of those are really apparent in the communities that we work with. And I think the one thing that has been really evident is that you just really need time for these you just have, they need to take as long as they need to take, as opposed to pushing an outcome sometimes. And I think we were kind of but whilst we both have really great relationships with elders within the community and traditional owners, I think it has taken a lot of, you just have to go at a pace that is along, you know, with them. You can't really rush those things, I think. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
It's
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was fun.
Sure, everyone really enjoyed, our classmates in the program and everyone in the department. Thanks so much for making the time. And also we have next week, our next guest is Memoria Trans Archive from Mexico City. It's on the 7th of December, Wednesday, then back to regular time, 7 p.m. in Estonia. And yes, after this, we have one more lecture with the writer Romy Ruger, and it's the last one of the season. Thank you so much, Roberta and Naomi.
Thank you both.
No worries. Thank you.
you.
Take care.